How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on the 4th of July. Thank you, God, for the gift of America. What a wonderful place to live. What a fortunate and blessed place to live, to call our own, our country. I'm very proud to be an American citizen. My family left Ukraine, refugees from pogroms, attacks on Jews. My family, other members of my family survived the Holocaust and the attacks on Jews in Hungary and the continuing attacks on Jews in Soviet Hungary, and they escaped from there. And my family saw the rise of communism in Chile in 1970, and the Hungarians in the family said, we've seen this story before, and we left Chile and we were blessed to come to America. And when I turned 18, I became an American citizen and got an American passport. And here in America, I can walk around wearing my kippah, wearing my fringes, looking like a Jew. I'm free to worship God through my religion, and there is no state religion here. The American experiment, as Lincoln referred to it, the first and greatest experiment in this kind of democracy, has been such a gift to so many people, and we appreciate it, and we don't take it for granted. Thank you, God. Thank you, America, for this gift. And what better way to celebrate our freedom in this land, the land of America, than by learning Torah together on the 4th of July. One last note. I saw a video with the actor John Schneider saying that the American anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, is unlike, he said, all the other national anthems in the world. I don't know that for sure. But it is generally understood that a national anthem proclaims, the greatness of a nation, what's great about that country, what's beautiful about that country, what they're grateful about in that country, the hope that they have for that country. But the American anthem opens and ends with the same question, right? The question is the flag still waving? And it was during a bombardment by a British ship of an American fort, and they bombed it all night. And there was an American, Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer negotiating for the return of captives, the return of hostages, not hostages, but captives, military captives, American soldiers who were on the British warships. And while he was there, he watched from the water this bombardment of the fort. And the other prisoners were asking him, because he had a view of the fort and the prisoners didn't. And they asked him, is the flag still there? Are those stars and stripes still waving, right? Does the country still stand? Does this experiment in letting the people govern themselves still work? Thank God it does. Okay, let's who's in the house? Let's light up the wisdom candle. We're not going to do fireworks, but here we go. A bit of fire on the 4th of July. And who's in the house with us? John in Maine, Lucy in Minnesota, Bill in mid-Missouri, Shandora in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck. Paul is going to catch up tomorrow. Guy wishing everyone a happy 4th. Jonathan in Thousand Oaks. Joseph in Boston. Certainly the seat of so much history. Joe in the Inland Empire. And also with us, Ella and Marjorie from Georgia and Aoife from Florida. And Marjorie says, whoops, I mean Virginia. Believe me, I forget what room I've just come into. Okay, it's great to be learning together, everybody. And we've got a barnstormer of a daf for you today. Fascinating. The context is so interesting, and even when we get into somewhat of the technical aspects of the laws we'll cover tonight, that becomes interesting as we understand what we're actually discussing. So Our daf today is page 47. We picked this up near the bottom of 46b here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 4. Tonight we open with Mishna number 12, and we'll get to Mishna number 13 as well here in chapter 4. Now, these are the laws of the divorce, and specifically the bill of divorce that we're covering in this tractate, but we've seen that there's many areas of common ground between the law of the bill of divorce, right, which frees the couple from each other. They now are no longer permitted to each other, and so they become permitted to the rest of the world for marriage. And there's a lot of analogs to the law of master and slave, and specifically how slaves were freed when slavery existed in the ancient world, which slave needed a document of freedom, right? The bill of manumission. When was it given? When was it not given? We've covered a lot of digressions in this chapter, some having to do with the laws of slavery, and others that were related to the get itself, but always in the context of tikkun ha'olam, rabbinic decrees that were better, created laws that made society work better. That's tikkun ha'olam. So here, Mishnah number 12 says, with regard to one who sells himself and his children as slaves to goyim, right? Goyim means nations, but we use it to mean non-Jews, right? So we usually translate it as Gentiles. But it's important to note that when we actually say this in Hebrew, we're saying one who sells himself to the goyim, right? And goyim is a misunderstood term. It is not pejorative, right? Even though, there's always going to be some kind of a preference of people in a group for in-group, versus out of group. But what the word really means is nations, right? So one who sells himself to the nations. And what does that really mean? He sells himself out of his own nation, right? So we're talking about here, now we've said over and over again that there's a problem when a slave is sold from a Jewish owner to a Gentile owner. And this is both in the case of a Jewish slave, which was temporary, 6 years, unless he chose to remain in slavery. And that's with a Jewish master, and also Canaanite slaves who would be owned by a Jewish master. And in both cases, it was a very bad outcome that the slave would be transferred to a non-Jewish master. And you can see that we have all these laws in the Torah that actually protect slaves. Slaves have rights. That was an amazing innovation when the Torah was brought into the world. But they only have rights if they're owned by a family or by an owner that subscribes to the laws of the Torah. So if they go out of Jewish ownership into the nations, then whoever purchases them will have absolute power over them, can do anything they want with them, even kill them, and they have no rights, right? Also, while they have a Jewish owner, part of the rights that they enjoy is that they are permitted and even obligated in some of the commandments of the Torah that are incumbent upon Jews. The slave actually has a holier state than someone who is, not a Jew and not a slave of Jews. He's able to perform certain mitzvahs and is operating at a certain level of holiness, which if he's sold out of a Jewish family to a non-Jewish family, or even sold to a Jewish family that resides outside of the land of Israel, then some of those mitzvahs that apply to a slave within the land of Israel will no longer apply to him. He won't be able to connect with God via those commandments that obligate him. That would lower his holiness level, and the sages protect him against that. Now, we're talking about a Jew who sells himself to slavery. Okay, obviously he can't pay his debts. He's going to have to, in the ancient world, there was, maybe he had no other way out than to sell himself into slavery to pay off his debt. Obviously, he should sell himself into slavery with a Jewish family who will respect his rights as a Jewish slave in a Jewish family with a Jewish owner. But if this Jew sells himself to non-Jews, well then, what's he doing? Why would he do that? It's like he doesn't care about his holiness level at all. He doesn't care about these rights and protections that he might enjoy under Torah. He doesn't seem to care about much of anything. I mean, he's desperate. He's in an absolutely desperate situation. So, does he then qualify for redemption of captives, right? It's a mitzvah that we talked about in the previous Mishnah, that if a Jew is caught, let's say, in a war, is captured by marauders, captured by an enemy army, then we redeem him from captivity. It's a mitzvah to redeem the captive. The sages instituted for tikkun ha'olam, for the betterment of the world, that they put a cap on how much money could be spent by the community. The family can spend whatever they can raise, but the community is only going to spend a certain amount so that the kidnappers are not encouraged to kidnap more people, right? The goal is to keep the number of kidnappings down, and sometimes you have to cap the price and the negotiations with the terrorists and the kidnappers in order to do that. But one who isn't captured by the marauding army, but rather sells himself to the enemy, sells himself to the outsider, are we going to spend community resources to redeem that person? Right? So the Mishnah seems to say no, but not so fast. Not so fast. Now let's read it again carefully, and then we'll get into the Gemara. With regard to one who sells himself and his children as slaves to Gentiles, he is not redeemed, but the children are redeemed after their father's death. We do redeem the children, but we don't do while the father is still alive, and we don't redeem the father. That's what the Mishnah seems to say. Now watch, that's the conclusion as it's stated by a nameless, right, by an anonymous Tana of the Mishnah. Usually, unattributed Mishnayos are actually formulated by Rabbi Meir. But at least this seems to be the opinion of the sages. Now, the Amoraim of the Gemara, the rabbis of the Gemara, will clarify the limits of this ruling, and right away putting limits on it, putting boundaries on how far this extends, enables us to understand it at a much deeper level. Now, the Gemara, Rav Asi says, and this law, that this Jew who sells himself into slavery, into ownership by non-Jews, into the nations, who sells himself into slavery among the nations, applies only when he sold himself for a first time and was redeemed, and repeated his action by selling himself a second time and was redeemed, and then he repeated his action by selling himself a third time. Since he sold himself repeatedly, the sages penalized him by instituting that he may not be redeemed again. Okay. You do redeem the guy. His situation was desperate. Okay, he sold himself into slavery among the non-Jews. Maybe he had no choice. Maybe he was starving. Maybe he was pressured. Maybe he was coerced. Who knows what his situation was? We don't know. We meet this person in the middle of our discussion. What's his background? How could we judge him? But if he sells himself into slavery among the nations and the Jews redeem him from slavery, and then he does it again, we redeem him again. In other words, we're obligated to redeem him. And we do it twice, and then he sells himself into slavery again. Okay, what are we going to do with this guy? We gave him the benefit of the doubt twice. That's a very different law than if he sells himself into slavery, we don't redeem him. Period, right? So we needed that clarification and amplification of what the law actually means here in the Gemara. Now, the Gemara relates. There were those residents of Bei Miksi who borrowed money from the nations, and they did not have sufficient funds to repay them. And as a result, the people of the nations, the Gentiles, came and seized them as slaves. So they came before Rav Huna and requested that he instruct the Jews to redeem them. Rav Huna said to them, "What can I do for you?" As we learned in a Mishnah. With regard to one who sells himself and his children as slaves to Gentiles, he is not redeemed. Rabbi Abba said to Rav Huna, "Our master taught me, and this law applies only when he sold himself and repeated a second time and then repeated a third time. That's when we don't redeem him. This hasn't happened here. These people, borrowed a bunch of money. They knew they could be seized as slaves if they didn't pay it back. They didn't pay it back. Then they were seized. Why would we not redeem them? This is not somebody who sold himself into slavery 3 times after being redeemed the first 2 times." Rav Huna said to Rabbi Abba, these people do this habitually, and it is as though they sold themselves for a second and third time. Right? Now you can get the picture, if this was like a mob movie. These people, it's very unfortunate for the family. It sounds like maybe the father, maybe the parents. It's like they're what do you call it? Degenerate gamblers, right? Who keep getting into debt with the loan shark and putting the whole family at risk. And then other family members bail them out by paying off the loan shark. But how many times are you going to do that, right? The Gemara relates, a certain man sold himself to gladiators. He came before Rabbi Ami and said to him, redeem me. Now we're on 47a. Okay, now we're really starting to get a picture here. Where it's part of the Roman Empire, right? Now we're talking about the Gemara. The Gemara is a commentary on the Mishna. The Mishna closes about the year 200. Now we're talking about incidents that may have happened before the year 200 or after the year 200, but in approximately that area during the Roman Empire. They had the Roman circus, right? What was the Roman circus? It wasn't like Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey circus. It was gladiators, it was throwing enemies of the state to the lions and forcing slaves to fight each other to the death for the entertainment of the Roman upper classes, maybe also the middle and lower classes. But life was cheap, right? Especially the lives of slaves. And so it could happen that somebody who was in a desperate situation, he could just sell himself into one kind of slavery and, toil in terrible conditions in a factory, or he could sell himself to slavery and be a gladiator, and who knows, maybe he'll get lucky and get good at it and beat a bunch of people and maybe eventually purchase his freedom, although it's very likely that in all those fights to the death he would actually die. Okay, and this was a kind of slavery. Being a gladiator made you a slave, right? You were a slave gladiator. These guys sound like heroes, but they were slaves fighting each other for the entertainment of the Romans. So, the Gemara relates, a certain man sold himself to gladiators. He came before Rabbi Ami and said to him, redeem me, redeem me. Rabbi Ami said to him, we learned in a Mishnah, with regard to one who sells himself and his children as slaves to Gentiles, he is not redeemed. However, his children are redeemed due to the harm of becoming assimilated among the Gentiles. And all the more so here, where there is a concern that leaving the children in bondage may lead to their death, and perhaps leaving you to remain a slave will lead to harm that could, because it's not just that this Jew sold himself to Gentiles, right? Which we've learned if he did it, the first and second time, we do redeem him. But all the more so if he sold himself into a type of slavery where his life is in mortal danger every day, which is this kind of slavery. So maybe he does get redeemed. The sages said to Rabbi Ami, this man is a Jewish apostate. As they saw him, and then they'll explain what they mean now. Now, the other day, I misspoke. We were looking at a certain passage where there was a bunch of cases mentioned about who could be witnesses and who you could have who you could make an exchange with. I don't even remember what the issue was, but in the list there was both a Jewish apostate and a heretic, right? An apicorus. So I said that this is the same thing, but it's not. Okay. So what is the difference between a Jewish apostate and a Jewish heretic? Right? Both are Jews. The Jewish heretic denies God, makes statements that deny the existence of God. The Jewish apostate insults the honor of God, right? Doesn't care about God and goes even further and insults the honor of God actively and in public. Okay? So here we're talking about one who insults God. What does that mean? As the sages said to Rabbi Ami, this man is a Jewish apostate, as they saw him when he was eating nevela, unslaughtered animal carcasses, right? Meat from an animal that might be a kosher animal but was not butchered in a kosher manner, so that's not permitted for Jews to eat. And animals with a wound that will cause them to die within 12 months. That's a treifa, again, It starts as a kosher animal, but becomes unkosher because it suffered a wound that will cause it to die. If it had a certain, like a needle in its lung, there's all kinds of things that will render an animal a treif, although it seems to be healthy. But at any rate, here there's meat that is definitely prohibited for Jews to eat, and this man was eating it. Does that make him an apostate? I mean, there's a lot of Jews that sadly don't, will eat non-kosher meat, but that's not what was going on here. And he said to them, say that he was eating them due to his appetite. Okay, so he was eating non-kosher food. He was very hungry. Not because he's an apostate, but because he was overcome by the temptation to eat what was in front of him. The sages said to Rabbi Ami, no. There are times when there are permitted and forbidden foods before him, and he sets aside the permitted food and only eats the forbidden food, indicating that it is not temptation alone that causes him to transgress, but rather he just dismisses, and insults the honor of God by dismissing, when it would be just as easy for him to eat the permitted food, but he would prefer to eat the prohibited food. So here that's being defined as a Jewish apostate. Once he heard this, Rabbi Ami said to the man, go, because they do not allow me to redeem you. Right? So they would not redeem this man when he sold himself to the Gentiles, because he had already acted in a dismissive manner toward his own Jewish community, his own Judaism, to God himself. Now, a new story about Resh Lakish. So this is awesome. I'd forgotten this story from a previous journey through the Talmud, and I was kind of blown away a couple hours ago when I was preparing. So we've talked about Resh Lakish many times. Resh Lakish is Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Lakish. He's such a colorful character. We talk about him very often. He was the debate partner, the closest friend, right, and discussion partner of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, there's the famous story that Resh Lakish in his youth was a bandit, right? He was a bandit. He was a criminal. He was a hardened, active criminal, a highwayman preying on people going down the roads. Maybe he was stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Maybe he was stealing from government convoys. I don't know, but he was a criminal, right? And he saw the Rabbi Yochanan from behind while Rabbi Yochanan was bathing in a river. And Rabbi Yochanan was known for his incredible good looks. He was such a handsome man that when he was presiding over town as its rabbi, the women would, make sure to walk by him on their way to the mikvah on mikvah night, right, when they were going to have date night with their husbands, because they hoped that their children would be as wise and as beautiful as Rabbi Yochanan. When Resh Lakish, as a young bandit, saw Rabbi Yochanan bathing in the river from behind, he thought it was a beautiful woman. And he jumped into the river and swam over, and then Rabbi Yochanan turns around, and Resh Lakish is like, whoa, I thought you were a beautiful woman, never mind. And Rabbi Yochanan said, it's amazing that you swam all the way across the river to save me. I know who you are. I know how crafty and smart and strong you are in, pursuing your criminality. If you would dedicate that kind of resources and wisdom and power to learning Torah, you would be a giant. Such a giant that I would marry off my sister to you. Right, so it was one of the great beauties of one of the great Torah families of the generation. It was a very huge offer, and Resh Lakish took him up on it. He said, "Teach me," and he started learning Torah at that late stage in his life, and ended up being one of the greatest sages in human history. A man whose behavior was above reproach. A man who made such a teshuvah, such an atonement, such a turnaround in his life. That he became not just one of the wisest, greatest teachers in Jewish history, one of the greatest elucidators of Jewish law, but one of the most righteous Jews in Jewish history. And when you make a teshuvah for your past misdeeds, right, all your previous sins actually become merits for you because you were so far off the Torah path, and that yet you managed to bring yourself back. That's why somebody who comes back to Torah, comes back to Judaism, is called a Baal Teshuvah, a master of atonement, right? A master of turning it around, of bringing it back. So that's the story we always hear about Resh Lakish. And so the image we have of Resh Lakish is, well, he must have grown up, among like very secular Jews who didn't care or know about Torah, who are probably criminals or drunkards themselves, something like that. We imagine in our minds. And then he ends up living a life of crime. And then Rabbi Yochanan rescues him from all that. But that is a mistaken impression. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Lakish, came from a Torah family. He turned away from it himself when he was young, but he had a Torah education as a young man. And then he left. He walked out on it. Why? We don't know right now. We're not covering that in this part of the story. But when he left, when he got himself in trouble, when he hit the road, when he wanted to get some kind of an adventure, what did he do? He sold himself to the gladiators. He became a gladiator slave. He sold himself into the slavery of the gladiators. And that's where he learned how to fight. And eventually, I guess he got out. Well, and as we'll see, he got out of it. And then he lived on his own, free spirit, right? So the gladiator became a bandit. He was a gladiator bandit. But now we understand how he learned to fight and how, big and strong and, capable he was as a warrior. So now that we have a little bit, now we're going to hear that story a little bit. Now we understand Resh Lakish so much better. Resh Lakish, the story begins right like this. Resh Lakish sold himself to gladiators. Unexplained where he was coming from, what he was doing. Resh Lakish sold himself to gladiators. Right? So we have a little bit of personality about this. I've already told you this part of it, right? So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, typically referred to as Resh Lakish, was among the greatest Amoraim of the land of Israel. He was the friend and brother-in-law of Rabbi Yochanan. Resh Lakish had a fascinating life story. He studied Torah from a young age. That's the news today. He studied Torah from a young age, but perhaps, due to dire financial straits, sold himself to a Roman circus as a gladiator. There are many stories in the Talmud that attest to his great strength. Sometime later, in the wake of meeting Rabbi Yochanan, he resumed his Torah study, as I just explained a moment ago. This earlier part of the story, that definitely changes our understanding of the book of Resh Lakish's life, as it were. So, here we just learned the very simple, Resh Lakish sold himself to gladiators. He took a bag and a round stone inside the bag with him into slavery. He said to his captors, there is a tradition that on the final day of a captive's life, before his captors kill him, they do for him anything that he requests of them so that he would forgive them for the spilling of his blood. Now we're starting to get a whole other picture. Maybe Resh Lakish was such a hero as a young man that it was like, he and his family were on the road, or he ran away from his family. He and his friends were on the road, and the Romans were bearing down on them. I'm thinking like a movie director, right? And they were capturing, slaves in the countryside to turn into, work slaves, or the stronger ones maybe into gladiators. And to, and you could always picture Resh Lakish saying to his friends, go that way, and I'll let them catch me. I have a plan. And so his friends escape. He allows himself to be caught, but he goes into his captivity with a plan already in mind how he's going to get out. That's what we're hearing here. How is he going to do it? He took with him a small bag with a rock in it. What's he going to do? And he says to his captors, okay, you're going to kill me. But we have a tradition that on the last, you have a final wish before you die. A lot of jokes start that way, right? And he says, and you should grant me this wish because you're about to kill me. And, the world visits consequences on murderers. So maybe you can escape your consequences by allowing me this final wish. So they agreed. On the final day, before they were set to kill him, they said to him, all right, what do you want? What is amenable to you? He said to them, I want to tie you up and have you sit, and I will strike each one of you 1.5 times. 1.5 times. I'm going to hit you 1.5 times. So they're imagining Okay, you're going to punch me twice. You're going to punch me, I guess, one full punch and one half punch. Yeah, okay. Go for it. He tied them up, right? They allowed themselves to be tied up. And he had each one of them sit. When he struck each of them with one strike, right? The one hit with the rock in the bag. The one whom he struck died. He killed him with the first shot because Resh Lakish was of great strength. Resh Lakish gritted his teeth in anger and said to the one whom he had killed, in order to prevent the others from realizing what was happening, "Are you laughing at me?" So in other words, he went up to each one, hit him with this trick rock so hard that he killed him. But to not let the other ones know that their friend had died, he kept yelling at him like, "What, are you going to mock me? Like, you think I didn't hit you hard enough? You still got one more punch coming. That was just the full punch, but I got another half punch coming to me." Even though he knew they were already dead. "Are you laughing at me? You still have half a punch remaining. You still have half a strike remaining with me, as I struck you only once." And in this manner, he was able to kill all of his captors. And then Resh Lakish escaped. He left and came back home, and after some time had passed, he was sitting, eating, and drinking without concern for his livelihood. Now that we understand who Resh Lakish was, totally different story, has nothing to do with selling yourself into slavery, but we're learning something about the end of Resh Lakish. Resh Lakish as an old man, right? A beautiful detail about him as an old man. So he would sit and eat and drink. He enjoyed life, and he wasn't too worried about how much money he had or where he was going to make a few dollars to pay for tomorrow's dinner, as long as he had dinner on the table today. Right? He was sitting, eating, and drinking without concern for his livelihood. And his daughter said to him, "You don't want something to lie upon?" He said to her, "My daughter, my belly is my pillow, and this is enough for me." He was a man of modest tastes, right? There were some sages that were well-to-do businessmen and lived in great luxury and comfort, and others who lived, in great poverty because they didn't care. They just wanted to learn Torah all day. Resh Lakish is more in that latter category. When he died, he left only a kav of saffron, so a quantity of spices that had some value. That's all that he had to his name when he died. That's all he had as an inheritance. And even so, he recited this verse about himself, "And they leave their wealth for others," from Psalm 49:11, meaning that he was pained that he did not use all of his property. Right? He wasn't trying to leave an estate. He thought, I should only have what I need to live, and I shouldn't try to accumulate any kind of wealth. That's the way he viewed his journey through the world. Just whatever God saw fit to bestow on him so that he could get by, that's all that he needed. That's the way this is elucidated here. I also think that from Psalm 49:11, it's if you just read right on the surface, "and they leave their wealth for others," you can say about Resh Lakish, he may not have left material wealth, but did he leave a wealth of legal acumen and wisdom, tradition, and teachings for the betterment of people and for the understanding of Torah and for our illumination? Yes, he left a vast inheritance of that. And that concludes our discussion of Mishna number 12 here in chapter 4. Now that we've learned a bit about Resh Lakish in the context of we don't redeem one who sells himself to the Gentiles unless he does it repeatedly. I mean, we only don't redeem him if he does it repeatedly, but we will redeem him the first couple of times. That was Mishna number 12. Now here comes Mishna number 13, which is more technical, but Resh Lakish is going to be one of the people arguing one of the viewpoints in this discussion. Mishnah 13. One who sells his field to a Gentile must purchase and bring the first fruits from the field that he sold for tikkun ha'olam. When a Gentile owns a field, even in Israel, right? I mean, certainly outside of Israel. But if a Gentile owns a field in Israel, during the time that Israel is in its highest state of holiness, when all of the produce of all the fields has to be tithed, and the temple is standing, and the priests are there to receive the teruma, right, the 2% that goes to the priest, etc., when the nation is functioning with all Torah cylinders firing, as it were, Can a Gentile own land in the land of Israel? Seems that he can, as we'll see. And if he does, well, now that produce doesn't belong to a Jew. It belongs to the Gentile who owns the land. Must the Gentile tithe the way that a Jew would be obligated to tithe, even though he is not obligated in the laws of the Jews? What are we going to do? So here we're talking about one who sells his field. Now his field, like if he sold his slave, the slave is no longer able to observe certain commandments. Likewise, this field, it's an inanimate object, but when it was owned by a Jew in ancient Israel, produce came out of it, and 2% went to the priests, and 10% went to the Levium, and the next 10% went to the poor in certain years, and to those celebrating the festivals in Jerusalem in other years. So the land's own holiness level is going to drop if it's sold outside of the Jewish community. So a penalty for selling to the Gentiles is that the Jew, even though he no longer owns the field, has to purchase the first fruits that come out of that field and bring them to Jerusalem as the offering of the first fruits, even though he doesn't own that field anymore. And this will maybe remind him that that field really should be his. He still has to bring the first fruits if he should find a way to purchase it back from the Gentile that he sold it to. So that's Mishna number 13. Here's the Gemara. Rabbi says, even though a Gentile has no capability of acquisition of land in the land of Israel, a Gentile cannot acquire land in the land of Israel, but he can. No, but his acquisition of land does not cause the abrogation of the sanctity of the land, thereby removing it from the obligation to tithe its produce. As it is stated, Leviticus 25:23, God says, "For the land is mine," which teaches the sanctity of the land is mine, is God's, and it is not abrogated when the land is sold to a Gentile. A Gentile does have, however, the capability of acquisition of land in the land of Israel to allow him to dig pits, ditches, and caves in the land that he has purchased. As it is stated, the heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth he has given to the children of men. So if a Jew sells his land to a Gentile, the Gentile can do whatever he wants with that land, right? He doesn't have to plant it. He can dig caves, ditches, whatever. But here's the point, if the Jew comes and then buys the land back, right? He buys the land back. Now, would you say that since the land had been owned by a Gentile for some time who was not obligated to tithe the land, and now the Jew purchased it back, maybe it lost its sanctity when it went out of the Jewish community, and now even though it's been purchased back into the Jewish community, maybe its sanctity went away, it was canceled, and now the Jew doesn't tithe this produce. Lest you think that, we're learning that no, the fact that the Gentile acquired it and owned it for a while does not abrogate its sanctity. When the Jews reacquire the piece of land, they must tithe it. And Rabbi Lazar says, even though a Gentile has the capability of acquiring land in Eretz Yisrael, and to cause the abrogation of the sanctity of the land, removing it from the obligation to tithe its produce, as it is stated with regard to tithes, the tithe of your grain, which teaches that it is only the grain of a Jew that is obligated in tithes, and not the grain of a Gentile. So even if Jews farm the land as sharecroppers for the Gentile who owns the land, they don't tithe that produce because the Gentile owns it. Right? It is only the grain of a Jew that is obligated in tithes, and not the grain of a Gentile. A Gentile does not have, however, the capability of acquisition of land in Israel to allow him to dig pits, ditches, and caves in the land that he has purchased. As it is stated, the earth is the Lord. So this is an opposite view, that the Gentile who acquires land can't change it. But that's not the view of the first Tana. The Gemara asks, with regard to what principle do Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar, right? One says that the Gentile doesn't abrogate the sanctity, but he can change the land. The other says that he does abrogate the sanctity, but he can't change the land. So with regard to what principle do Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar disagree? And the Gemara answers, one of them, Rabbi Elazar holds that your grain teaches that only grain grown in the field of a Jew is obligated in tithes, but not the grain grown in the field of a Gentile. And the other sage, Rabbi, holds that your grain is not referring to the produce itself, but rather to your accumulation of the produce into a pile, which obligates the produce in tithes, and not the accumulation of the produce into a pile by a Gentile, as Rabbi holds that if a Gentile harvests and gathers grain, the grain is not obligated in tithes. Rabbi said, from where do I say that a Gentile's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael does not cause the end of the sanctity of the land with regard to tithes, as we learned in the Mishna and Tractate Peah 4:9, with regard to the gleanings that are left for the poor, and the forgotten sheaves that are left for the poor, and the produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor of a Gentile, one is obligated to tithe them unless the owner rendered them ownerless. The owner. So I'm a little bit confused here. Hold on a second. The gleanings of a Gentile. If a Gentile set aside gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and peah, then one is obligated to separate terumos and tithes from them. Okay, so the Gentile's not obligated to leave the forgotten sheaves or the gleanings or the corner of the field. Those are laws that obligate the Jewish owner of a Jewish field when he's harvesting his produce in the land of Israel when the temple is standing. But if a Gentile behaves that way, then the poor can come along. The poor really don't care who left the forgotten sheaves, who left the corners of their field. It's food for them, and they're gratefully take it. But people who receive charity, they themselves are obligated to tithe it. Right? So when the poor receive the corner of the field or the gleanings or the forgotten sheaves for their own consumption, they still have to set aside 2% for a priest and 10% for a Levite. Right? Even those who enjoy the largesse of the community and receive charity themselves have to tithe and give charity. Now, Rabbi said, from where do I say that a Gentile's acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael does not cause the abrogation of the sanctity of the land with regard to tithes, as we learned in a Mishna, with regard to the gleanings for the poor and the forgotten sheaves left for the poor? This is what I'm saying before. And the produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor of the Gentile, one is obligated to tithe them unless the owner rendered them ownerless. Interesting. So he has to just leave it there as if he's following the law that doesn't obligate him, but he's doing it anyway. But if he says, the stuff that I left on my field, it's ownerless. So he's not leaving it for the poor. He's just saying it belongs to nobody. That means that anybody who comes along, even somebody who's not necessarily poor, could grab it. The Gemara discusses what are the circumstances. If we say that this is referring to the gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and peah of a Jew, and a Gentile collected them and sold them to a Jew, then how could the Mishnah write unless he rendered them ownerless? But they are already ownerless, since gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and peah are already ownerless, as anyone can take them. Rather, is it not the case that the Mishnah is referring to produce of a Gentile, who then separated gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and peah, and declared them to be ownerless, and a Jew gathered them? And Rabbi explains his inference. The reason that this produce is exempt from tithes is specifically because the Gentile rendered it ownerless. But if he did not render it ownerless, then it would be obligated in tithes. One can infer from this Mishnah that the acquisition of land by a Gentile does not cause the abrogation of the sanctity of the land with regard to tithes. But the Gemara rejects that. No, actually it may be that these were gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and peah, the produce left in the corner, of a Jew, and a Gentile collected them. And that which you said, but they are already ownerless, is incorrect. Let it be that he rendered them ownerless with the intent that a Jew would collect them. But did he render them ownerless with the intent that a Gentile would collect them? He did not, in fact, render them ownerless, as he expected only a Jew to come along and collect them. Therefore, if a Gentile comes by first and collects them and sells them to a Jew, the Jew is obligated to tithe them. The Gemara suggests, come in here another proof from a Baraisa. If there was a Jew who acquired a field from a Gentile before its produce reached a third of its growth, at which point one is obligated to tithe the produce, and he then sold it to the Gentile after its produce reached a third of its growth, then the owner is obligated to tithe the produce because the produce already became obligated in tithes when it reached a third of its growth while under Jewish ownership. Very curious. You're growing a field full of wheat. When it reaches 1/3 of its growth, it is now wheat. It's not baby wheat, it's not future wheat, it's not prospective wheat. Now it's wheat. So now you have an obligation to tithe that field. But before you harvest the wheat, you sell the field to a Gentile. The Gentile's not obligated in the tithe. He's not going to tithe it. But because you owned that field, which had wheat grown to a third of its growth, you then owned a wheat field. And at that point, you became obligated in the tithe. So even though you sold your field to the Gentile, from the money that you got, you're going to have to go and purchase wheat to enable you to tithe, the 2% and the 10% as it stood at presumably the value when it was 1/3 its growth. The Gemara deduces from here, it is only when the produce became obligated in tithes while a Jew owned it that yes, the owner is obligated to tithe. But if the produce did not become obligated in tithes while under Jewish ownership, it didn't reach a third of its growth, then no, the owner is not obligated to tithe. And this teaches that produce that grows while the field is owned by a Gentile is exempt from tithes. And a Gentile's acquisition in Eretz Yisrael abrogates the sanctity of the land with regard to tithes. It's not a permanent abrogation. If the land returns to the ownership of the Jews, they will have to tithe it again. But while it is owned by a Gentile, it is not tithed. There might be a penalty that one who sells his field to Gentiles is going to have to scrape together the money to tithe, or not to tithe, actually just to bring the first fruits, as if he still owned it. But that's a penalty, and it's a rabbinic decree to discourage people from selling their fields to Gentiles. Not in a way that's so burdensome that it'll never happen, but in a way that it spiritually reminds you shouldn't do that. But the Gemara rejects this understanding that we were just saying about when that it's not that the sanctity is abrogated while a Gentile owns the field. Gemara rejects this. With what are we dealing here? We are not dealing with Eretz Yisrael proper. We are dealing with the land in Syria, which is close to Israel. And this Tana, this rabbi of the Mishna, holds that the conquest of an individual is not called a conquest, since Syria was conquered in battle by King David and not by the Jewish people under Joshua, not the Jewish people as a whole. Rather, it was King David's idea to conquer part of Syria. So it did not become bound by all the tithing laws that bind the land of Israel. It might have become part of the kingdom of Israel at one time, but it didn't become the Holy Land, the way that the rest of Israel is, as it was defined when Joshua brought the children of Israel into the Promised Land. The Gemara suggests, coming here a proof from a Baraisa, if there was a Jew and a Gentile who purchased a field in partnership, the produce grown in that field is considered to be untithed produce and non-sacred produce mixed together. That is the statement of Rabbi. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says the portion of the Gentile is exempt from terumas and tithe, and the portion of the Jew is obligated. Jew and non-Jew own produce together. What do they do about it? Okay, the part that belongs to the Jew, he tithes. The part that belongs to the non-Jew, it doesn't get tithed. Now, the Gemara explains they disagree only with regard to the following issue. One sage, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, holds that there is retroactive clarification, i.e., when they divide the produce, it will be clarified who owned what produce from the outset. And the other sage, Rabbi, holds that there is no retroactive clarification, and therefore, since it grew in a mixed state, it retains that status even after they divide the produce. However, everyone agrees that a Gentile has the capability of acquisition of land in the land of Israel and to cause the abrogation of the sanctity of the land, removing it from the obligation to tithe its produce, as the Gentile's portion is considered to be non-sacred produce. The Gemara answers, here also is referring to a case in Syria, and he holds that conquest of the land of Israel, conquest by an individual is conquest, and the other one holds that conquest by an individual by King David is not conquest, did not become part of the Holy Land. Rav Chia bar Avin said, come and hear a proof from the Mishnah. One who sells his field to a Gentile must purchase and bring first fruits from the field that he sold. That's the penalty mentioned in our Mishnah. We're back to our Mishnah now. One who sells his field to a Gentile must purchase and bring the first fruits from the field that he sold for the betterment of the world. And Rav Chia bar Avin infers, for the betterment of the world, yes. For tikkun ha'olam, yes, he must bring the first fruits. However, by Torah law, no. It's not that the field is obligated in first fruits when it's owned by a Gentile. It's not. It's just a rabbinic decree penalizing the Jew who sold his field to a Gentile, that he has to use his money and purchase the first fruits from that field and bring them to Jerusalem. And that will remind him that he shouldn't have sold his field and he should find a way to buy it back. Rav Ashi said there were two ordinances concerning this issue. Initially, those who sold their fields to Gentiles would bring first fruits by Torah law, as they held that the acquisition of a Gentile does not abrogate the sanctity of the land. Once the sages saw that Jews would sell their land to Gentiles when they had the opportunity, because these Jews thought that the fact that the Jew would still have to bring the first fruits indicates that the land retains its sanctity, and therefore there's no reason not to sell land to the Gentiles, then they instituted for those who sell land to the Gentiles that they should not bring the first fruits, to emphasize that the land should not be sold to Gentiles. This was the first ordinance. Once the sages saw that those who were not able to subsist would sell their land despite this ordinance, and the fields would remain in the possession of the Gentiles and would not be redeemed, so then the sages went back and instituted that the seller should bring the first fruits by purchasing them with their own money in order to penalize the seller to encourage him to repurchase the field. This was the second ordinance. Therefore, one cannot prove from the Mishnah whether or not the acquisition of a Gentile abrogates the sanctity of the land in tithes or not. It was stated with regard to one who sells his field for just its produce, meaning that he retains ownership over the land itself, and he sells the rights to all of its produce to someone else. With regard to this situation, Rabbi Yochanan says the purchaser brings first fruits from this field to the temple and recites the verses in the Torah associated with the bringing of the first fruits, in which he thanks God for the land which you, Lord, have given me. When you bring the first fruits, it's a beautiful spiritual experience. We haven't been able to do it since the temple was destroyed, but we know exactly how the procedure went. People would bring the finest fruits that came out of their land to Jerusalem. There would be such a party. The whole city decorated with these first fruits, some of which were brought and surrounding the altar at the temple, and the people would state, thank you, God, for giving us this land flowing with abundance and fruit and honey, and I'm healthy and my family's healthy, and you've given us a Torah and saved our ancestors, like all the things that God has done for us, and you make this statement. Now, only a Jew can make that statement about his nation, his tribe, his family, right? The statement is only for a Jew to make such a statement because it assumes that that a Jew is talking. Right? So it's stated, with regard to one who sells his field for just its produce, Rabbi Yochanan says the purchaser, the one who has purchased the produce, he brings first fruits from this field to the temple, and he recites the verse. The land which you, Lord, have given me, right? So he had the opportunity to purchase the produce, even though he didn't purchase the land. Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, but you got the produce, so you bring the first fruits to the temple. Resh Lakish disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan and says, no, Resh Lakish says, although the buyer brings the first fruits, he does not recite the verses because it is not his field. Right, so what they don't disagree that the purchaser brings the fruits. What they disagree on is whether the purchaser recites, thank you, God, for everything you've done for me, including this land that you have given me. But the purchaser doesn't own the land. He only owns the produce. So Resh Lakish says he has to speak the truth, right? So Resh Lakish was so righteous, so punctilious in his righteousness. He says you can't lie in any way, even something that implicates some kind of a minor mistruth, right? The guy who purchased the produce doesn't own the land, so he can't make this statement. Now the Gemara explains the reason behind the dispute. Rabbi Yochanan says he brings the first fruits and recites the verses because Rabbi Yochanan maintains that the acquisition of an item for its produce is considered like the acquisition of the item itself. Even though the field itself does not belong to him, it is as if he acquired the field because all the produce belongs to him in practice.
Resh Lakish says that he brings the first fruits and does not recite the verses because Resh Lakish holds that the acquisition of an item for its produce is not considered like the acquisition of the item itself. I'm getting close to the end. Questions or comments? Get them in. Rabbi Yochanan raised an objection to Resh Lakish from a baraisa concerning the bringing of the first fruits. As the verse states, and you shall rejoice in all of the good that the Lord your God has given to you and your house. And the phrase, your house, usually refers to a wife. Therefore, the sages said, this teaches that a man brings his wife's first fruits, and he recites the relevant verses on their behalf, the couple's behalf. And this is true despite the fact that a husband acquires the field of his wife only for the produce. Right? As we see many times, if a woman brings a field into her marriage, the husband is entitled to the produce for as long as they're married. But if they divorce and she leaves the marriage, she takes her fields with her. The husband never owned the field. He owned the rights to the produce. Resh Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, it is different there in the case of a married couple, as it is written explicitly, and to your house, which teaches that with regard to first fruits, there is a scriptural decree that a field belonging to one's wife is also included in the mitzvah. This does not prove that in general, the acquisition of a field's produce is considered to be like the acquisition of the field itself. And there are those who say that the exchange went differently. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish raised an objection to Rabbi Yochanan from that baraisa. It is written, and to your house, which teaches that a man brings his wife's first fruits, and he recites the relevant verses. So Resh Lakish infers from this, there it is that he brings the first fruits and recites the verses, despite having acquired only the rights to the produce from his wife's field, because it is written explicitly in the Torah, and to your house, right? That it's like God has done so much for me and to my house, right? Which it refers to his household, right? His wife, his family. But generally, no. We only recite these verses when one is, has the rights to the produce for his wife, because that's mentioned in the Torah. But when you have the rights to the produce from some other field that you just purchased for money, no, you don't say these verses. Says Resh Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan said to Resh Lakish, I also state my reason from here, as I see the law of a man bringing the produce from his wife's field not as an exception, but as the source for the general principle that the acquisition of a field's produce is considered to be like the acquisition of the field itself. Resh Lakish raised an objection to Rabbi Yochanan based on a baraisa. If he was traveling on the road to Jerusalem and the first fruits of his wife's field were in his possession, and he heard that his wife died, then he brings the first fruits and recites the verses. One can infer if she died, yes, he brings the fruit and recites the verses, as he has now inherited the field itself. But if she did not die, then no, he does not recite the verses, because the acquisition of a field's produce is not considered like the acquisition of the field itself. And the Gemara answers, the same is true in that case, that even though she did not die, he does bring the fruits and he recites the verses, but it was not necessary for the baraisa to mention the possibility that she died, because it might enter your mind to say that there should be a rabbinic decree in this case due to the statement of Rabbi Yosei Bar Chanina concerning a similar law, a similar halacha. As Rabbi Yosei Bar Chanina says, we'll find out tomorrow, Wednesday, when we continue this discussion. Isn't it great to read the laws being argued by Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish, when we understand a little bit more who Resh Lakish was? The hour's late. Let's just take a couple questions and comments. Bill, the life of a gladiator was immensely expensive. The overwhelming majority of gladiators, A, did not fight to the death, and B, were free men who were in essence professional sportsmen. However, slave gladiators were a thing. Usually, they were the warm-up acts for the professional gladiators, riling up the crowd by watching their quick, sloppy, and often fatal or near-fatal fights. It's like, right, there's the... So you're telling me that the main event was the heavyweight championship of the world, and the undercard was backyard beefs, right? These videos of like amateurs just, putting on the boxing gloves and fighting with each other, and their lack of professional skill and experience is what would make such a fight entertaining to the onlookers.
And they often, so watching their quick, sloppy, and often fatal or near fatal fights. Meanwhile, to your earlier question, the entire Roman population enjoyed the ludi and circuses, from the poorest beggar in the city of Rome to the imperial family, and they lasted, I think, until about the 400s.
Thank you, Bill, for that background. I can always count on you for some Roman history.
I appreciate that. And other kinds of history in that part of the world. It helps so much to understand the context of these incidents. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Wednesday, as we seek to understand, this dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish about one who has the rights to the produce of a field rather than owning the field itself. When he brings the first fruits, they all agree that the one who has the rights to the produce brings the first fruits when the temple is standing. But does he recite the verses where you thank God for giving me so much, including the land, And he doesn't own the land. Pick it up tomorrow. Have a great night.